Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Mithu Lucraft and I'm a Marketing Director in the Research Marketing team at Springer Nature. Really nice to see you all here today. We are going to be talking about building a narrative for researchers around open research. So open access has been around for more than 15 years. We're seeing more researchers publishing openly and understanding the benefits, but what does the impact of that actually show us? So, as one librarian recently took the time to remind me, open isn't the end goal. Who are we reaching with our research? Thinking about both academic and wider impact. Is it reaching the public? Is it achieving societal benefits? Are they accessing the content on our own platforms as publishers, or where are they finding that content? And what does impact actually mean when it comes down to it? So, open research and open access impact is fairly ill-defined at the moment. I absolutely love this chart, and I've rolled it out a few times. It's from a paper that understands the health policy systems research environment, and in a systematic review of 83 publications, they identified 108 different definitions of impact. So that shows the scale of the problem that we have. But what's interesting here is how they started to gather up those different areas of impact. So a collection were around the real world impact in terms of what value the research is creating in the real world. Some was bibliometric, some was related very specifically to academic impact, and then others were around policy, for example. So we can start to see some themes developing. So for our panel today, we're not going to solve all of those challenges, but we'll start to talk from our own experiences about how we are currently assessing open access impact and what data we can see from our own platforms and systems. We're going to talk about what we know researchers are actively doing, and then we'll move the conversation around how can we make more progress, what motivates researchers to find out about impact, and what recommendations might we have for librarians. So to kickstart that process, I'm going to talk very briefly about what we've been doing at Springer Nature. We published more than 90,000 open access articles last year. We have over 600 fully open access journals and over 1,900 hybrid journals, and we also published our 500th open access book earlier this year. So with that breadth of content and information on publication, we've taken the time to do some fairly broad studies. These are two of those. One was published this time last year for open access books, and the second was published earlier this year looking at hybrid open access journals. So for both of those we did bibliometric analysis, and we looked at downloads as a measure of overall engagement of readership. We looked at citations as a measure for academic impact, and we looked at altmetric attention as a proxy for attention from the wider public and wider readers. So for both of those, they are publicly available for download, and what we found was there is clear benefits from open access. So for books, that were 7 times more downloads. For the hybrid journals, we looked at 4 times more downloads. For citations, for the open access book study, we found 50% more citations, and for the hybrid journals, 1.6 times more. And then in terms of attention, for the books, that was 10 times more online mentions, and that was within the first year of publication, so within that immediacy of being published, that was when you were seeing that attention as well. And the same for the hybrid journal, so 2.5 times more attention. Alongside that, the bibliometrics only tells part of the story, so we've been having active conversations with as many researchers as we can, and this is a snapshot that we published during Open Access Week as an Open Voices campaign. And it's not surprising that some of the themes that researchers tell us about in interviews, in roundtable discussions, in surveys is they're seeing a broader, more diverse audience engaging with their content. They're seeing a lot more attention, they're seeing public engagement, they're seeing media interaction. So those are some of the ways that researchers are experiencing that impact from their open publishing. If you want to hear more on that topic, you can come to a session that my colleague Ros Pine is chairing tomorrow on OA books specifically, where we'll be digging into some of that in more detail. But for now, I'm going to introduce my co-panelists today. We have David Summer, who is Product Director and Co-founder at Kudos. We have Rachel Dorchard, who's Associate Director of Research and Instruction Services at American University. And we have Sarah Rui, who is Director of Engagement and Advocacy for Altmetric and Dimensions for Digital Science. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David.
I'm going to rotate around after each presentation. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I'm David Summer, co-founder and product director at Kudos, or Kudos, as I have to remember to say when I'm in the States. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Kudos, we are a dissemination management platform, and the aim is to help researchers get more visibility for their work. So it's not just about working within the academic audience, but also about broader audiences. So talking about policymakers, funders, educators, industry and the public. So let's start off with a bit of context. So there's something like $1.5 trillion spent on research per year. I converted that number from British pounds, but it's still a very big number, whatever currency that's in. And something like $200 billion of that is distributed through universities. So through funding, through tenure, through grants and so on. So a massive amount, which then generates something like 2 million publications per year. Many of those open access, an increasing percentage. However, the shocking truth is that something like 50% of those publications are never read, and 90% are never cited. Now, we can argue about the exact percentages there, but I've seen publisher data that shows that actually that's not so far off. So over half of all of that work being invested in, particularly with open access, where those APCs are being paid by the researchers or the institution, is being wasted. So that is a real problem. Fundamental point I want to make here is that availability is not the same as accessibility. So just because it's free, just because you could access it, doesn't mean you will access it. So how do we actually make sure that open access content that can be available is actually accessed and used? Really, really important point. So that's the challenge we at Kudos set out to solve. So just very briefly, the way we help make that availability into accessibility is through letting researchers, so people like people at your institutions, explain their work in plain language, share that across different dissemination channels, and then measure the results so they can see which of those actions are most effective. So just to give you an example, this is an open access paper published in F1000 on the Zika virus. And here, 3 of the authors have gone in and created a profile page for their publications. They put in a plain language title. They've created a what's it about, so a plain language, non-technical summary about the publication. Why is it important? So why is it timely? Why is it unique? Why should somebody spend time actually engaging and reading this? A personal perspective, giving the story behind how this fits in to each of those authors' research journey, and then resource links off to slides, data sets, potentially on Figshare, and so on. And then there's a great big republication button with an OA logo, very important. So we don't host any content, we're driving traffic towards where the primary source of that is. So that's what I mean by explaining. Sharing is about creating trackable links and then disseminating that through various networks, email, blogs, Twitter, Facebook, social media, sharing PDFs that can be put legally on ResearchGate and on platforms. And then measure is all about working out which channels were most effective, because there's an awful lot of time being spent disseminating this work, but actually which of those is effective, which of those is less effective. So we provide those metrics back to the researcher, including bibliometric from digital science, as well as citations and other data. So availability, not accessibility. But when we talk about accessibility, we've got to think about which audiences are important. So we actually did a survey earlier this year, and we had about 7,000 researchers respond to this. And we said to them, other than the academic audience, which other audiences are important to you? And 82% said educators. We want to get our work in front of educators. 72% policymakers and an industry and the public behind that. So researchers seem to be very interested in getting their work in front of different audiences, and you need different messaging, different techniques for different audiences. One size fits all really doesn't work here. We also asked those researchers how much time they're spending disseminating their work. 23% said they spend 1 day a week, every week. So 20% of their time is spent disseminating their research. With a further quarter saying they spend about half a day a week doing that. So that's half of researchers are spending at least half a day a week disseminating their work. That is a significant amount of time. So a couple of slides to wrap things up. I want to also talk about the axis of communication. So if you think about an axis of visibility, that goes from public to private, and an axis of persistency that goes from persistent to ephemeral, then you've got sort of 4 quadrants where communication is happening. So posting to a blog, Twitter, and so on, it's public and it's persistent, it's always there. There's private channel communications, a lot of communications happening through email, closed networks, private LinkedIn groups, and so on. There's private ephemeral type work happening at events, so poster sessions, leaflets, talks, science fairs, and so on. And then we've got the public ephemeral work, so such as talking at a museum, for example. So there's a lot of work going on outside of the traditional blogging, Twitter type channels there. And then layering on top of that, we've got all of the different people helping communicate that work. It's not just the researcher, it's the institution, the funder, the publisher, editors, everybody working together. So there's quite a lot here. You've got to think about the different channels, the different audiences, and the people who are going to be working together to help maximise the visibility there. I'm not going to say very much about this at all because I'm out of time, but we're launching a product for research groups next year, which will enable research groups to work together, so perhaps a lab, a department within your institution, create a dissemination plan, then create profile pages, measure that, and then report back. So we're piloting that at the moment. If any of you are interested, come and chat with me at the end, and I'll be very happy to share a bit more about that.
Can I tweet that?
You can tweet that, yeah, tweet away. So, to wrap it up, availability is not accessibility. We're not trying to measure impact. Impact could take 20 years to actually measure what was impactful. So we're focusing on dissemination and effective dissemination, because without effective dissemination, there can be no impact. Thank you very much. So, I will just click on to... There we go. Is that the right one? Fantastic. And if I click the... yeah. We should be good. Right, over to you.
All right, so as a librarian, I'm kind of here to talk about how we package a lot of this information that the other 3 have talked about into 2 specific audiences at institutions, more at the administrative institutional level, and then to individual researchers based on my own experience at American University. So starting with institutional pitches, it's important to think about what they really respond to, what they're worried about, and what they care about. So obviously impact is a high priority, and discussing some of the ways open access correlates with high impact is definitely a big way to sell it. This is one of the charts showing citation counts for different types of OA materials. Sarah's going to talk some more about correlations. But benchmarking and fear of missing out, I would say, are 2 of the really big selling points when it comes to pitching OA and impact to an institutional audience in terms of what are peer institutions and aspirational peers doing with regards to open access initiatives, and how do we make sure that we aren't behind the times. And then finally, how are open access initiatives going to affect the bottom line, the budget? So with that in mind, I think there's a number of resources that we can pull together to start making those pitches. And these are some of them. As we know, open access is changing very rapidly. This was news from yesterday. There's probably going to be more tomorrow, but these are 2 key funders that are joining the OA 2020 movement, Plan S. So I think this helps provide context to this is happening. We're seeing some really big players joining OA 2020. And then on the right here, this is from Spark, and I'm sorry, this is way too small to see. But it's big deal cancellations, and I know that there's another session on big deal cancellations here. But that's another thing that we can use to say, this is happening, the landscape is changing, people are starting to cancel, here's who's canceling and how much money they've saved. And I think that that presents a really impactful picture to administrators that they'll listen to. Coalition S also brings together a lot of the big players and just shows you really nicely who's involved. And then WARMAP also has university initiatives regarding open access. So you can even look at your peers, your aspirational peers, and say which of them have open access policies. Maybe we need to get on board, maybe we need to push farther, this is what the other ones have. So I think those are all some institutional level pitches. And then on the individual researcher side, it's a little bit different. I think of it in terms of carrots and sticks, and what are they going to get, and why should they do this, regardless. So I think very similar to what David said, that findability and searchability is key when talking about open access. That's really the key to high impact, is making sure that people can find your work in order to cite it. So we're talking about the role, and this is where we can build in a lot of different library resources like the institutional repository. Tools like on paywall are making it much easier for people to find open access content than ever before, all of which increases the findability of your work should you publish open access. Through Altmetrics products, we can more easily track engagement, that they're also just contributing to the openness of research, which is a public good, right? Just appealing to their own innate goodness, and that we can help pay for it if libraries have those open access funds to play article process alternatives. So lots of different types of carrots and then sticks. Impact, I think at this point, citation article level impact is something that's really good to talk about, and when you can work in slides like the one I just showed, showing the overall increase in citation count for individual articles. And then if your institution does have an open access initiative, that's another stick for them, things that they have to be doing anyway. And this is just part of a larger workflow because the way I sell it to my own institutional researchers is part of these bigger discussions. So this was actually something that I did last week with one of our schools on campus, and this was the title of our 2-hour workshop with food. So that's another tip I have, but this is all of the topics that I personally covered. I was one of 3 speakers, and you'll see not all of them are open access, but many of them have applicability to open access. So my big takeaway is, if you title a workshop, "Come learn more about open access," you're not necessarily going to be grabbing researchers in the same way as if you say, "Come learn about how to strengthen your impact profile," and then sneak OA into the edges. So that is my 5 minutes. And now, thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Sorry, I'm trying to tweet and
Last shuffle.
yeah. Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I work in digital science, originally with Altmetric, still with Altmetric. I'm now involved in Dimensions launch as well, which you may or may not have heard of. I'll be using both tools, data, to tell you a bit about what we're finding with respect to open. Just a quick background for folks who may not be familiar with digital science. We are a umbrella of 12 portfolio companies, each with a niche expertise in some aspect of the research lifecycle. Some of the organizations you might have heard of: Figshare, Altmetric, Symplectics has the Elements product, ReadCube for researchers. There's a lot of different logos there that you might recognize. We're all separate companies, but we share teams, data sets, our tools are interoperable, and we're vendor agnostic. So we work with everyone out there who's willing to work with us. So just a quick background on digital science itself. This is the sort of approach to open is really nicely articulated, I think, in the Figshare philosophy. Research output. Are folks familiar with Figshare? Data repository dedicated to making your data as open as possible and appropriate to meet funder mandates. So they've indicated that as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Ideally, academic research shouldn't be behind a paywall. Content should be human and machine readable. Infrastructure should work together. That's a really aspirational one in many ways. Identifiers for everything, just best practices around how we should treat research objects. And I think this really nicely encapsulates the digital science approach for each of the different companies. So just wanted to, sort of using data from Dimensions as of a couple days ago, the free version of the platform is live now. If you want to see the live numbers in real time, you can just go to app.dimensions.ai and see this data in real time. So we've seen over the last decade a growth of research of about 157% growth from 2009 until now. Overall, everything paywall, open, everything in one lump across all fields. If you look at the OA content over the last decade, and if you're looking at the free version of this, the OA filters at the bottom of the left side filters, the OA content has grown by 222%, which is an exciting story, and a story that I think we're going to see continue to happen thanks to efforts by publishers, by authors seeing the value, libraries really pushing their open access mandates, and funders. Unfortunately, the stick, I think, is always, unfortunately, more effective than the carrot. So funders, Gates Foundation, Plan S, all of that is going to play a big role in seeing this grow. we're finding that the paywall status is correlated to the citation trend. So this is one feature in this view in dimensions is that you can look at cited, not cited over time. And so for all of the citations that we have in our database as of now, dimensions generated citations. Looking at 2008, moving backwards, we see it takes about 2.5 years for you to possibly get one citation if the content is paywalled. Or excuse me, if this is looking at everything, so this sample includes paywalled and open content. If you isolate to just the open content, you'll find the citations happen quicker. And if you are trying to get researchers into your libraries, into your impact assessment workshops, these stories about how open content gets citations more quickly, how open content gets altmetric data, however you're measuring it, more quickly, this sort of gets to that self-interest part of the researcher that wants to facilitate dissemination and impact, however she's defining it. This is the altmetric over time. So if we're looking at all research over time, the percentage of content mentioned is less than 1/4. And by mentioned, we mean mentioned on the 17 kinds of platforms that altmetric tracks, from Twitter to Faculty of 1,000. There's a number of different ones. When you look at the OA content, we're seeing that we're getting close to 1/3 of that content is getting online attention. So again, a nice steady pattern of growth for more attention and more citations if the content is open, which seems intuitive, but I think we've been needing more data to justify that. Looking at our top 100, Altmetric list produces a list every year called the top 100 of the 100 highest scoring articles from the last November to the current November. So our new one is coming out. Last year, 31 of the 100 were open, and of the top 10, 3 were open. But there's a lot of research on this, as Rachel mentioned. I'll leave it at that. And that's it. 5 minutes. More than 5 minutes. 5 minutes 30.
Thank you. Okay, so we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to throw it straight over to you in the audience. Does anybody have a question? Yeah.
So my question is, so I'm Sheila Ribbon, and I'm the ORCID UX community specialist.
Yay!
So I'm interested in how all of this overlaps with ORCID. I know all of you are whoever you work for is using ORCID in some form or fashion. And I'm specifically thinking about, in terms of like assessing impact, and just if you could talk a little bit more about how ORCID could come into play with, assessing impact, but also trying to convince researchers to, and research institutions to go the open route.
Mm-hmm. So if anybody didn't catch all of that, so what role can ORCID play in convincing more researchers to publish openly and in demonstrating impact? Anybody want to take that one first?
I can. I think the number one thing with ORCID, to your question, is adoption, right? And so I think vendors making it a clear part of their workflows, funders making it a critical part of funding applications, publishers requiring it as part of the submission process. All of that is critical to getting researchers to update it, because as essential as ORCID is, it's only as good as what the researchers do with it. And I think we all know that researchers love having another profile to update, even though so much of ORCID is automated. So in terms of impact, I feel like ORCID tends to speak to the results of your efforts, as opposed to having it directly impacting your efforts. So it's almost sort of the end stage, but that's my 2 cents.
I mean, I can say how I talked about it last week at the workshop, was in making sure that people can find your research. And ORCID plays a big role in that. Having the number and linking to it, even in email signatures, is a really quick, easy thing to do. For a couple of reasons. One, if someone finds an article of yours and wants to see what else you've published, ORCID makes it much easier to do that. But 2, people are also looking for speakers. on a variety of issues and figuring out, again, what they've published. So we talk about Google Scholar and talk about ORCID as two of the primary reasons to do that. But we also talk about how you can take ORCID and then use it to populate information in other systems, like Scopus. So, and I also talk about control, that those are the two that you have control over, and that's a big deal. Because you can go and make changes yourself. You don't have to rely on algorithms. You don't have to rely on a database intervention. So those are some of the ways that I talk about ORCID.
And kudos, I mean, I think we were one of the very first integrators with ORCID, so we're a very big supporter, and we use that as a way of saving time for the researcher. So if you claim all your work on ORCID, you can import all of that directly into QDOS rather than searching and typing in DOIs and so on, and we display that on the profile page. So yeah, I think it's all about adoption and then selling the benefits, what's in it for the researcher to use that. And when we start looking at credit and attributing efforts back to individual researchers, much easier to do that if we know which John Doe is which.
I think that's the only other thing I'd add from a publisher's perspective is tying it up with credit and the opportunity. I think that's the opportunity, tying it up with open is your work is easier to share. So aligning that with people knowing where to find it and associating it with you would be the obvious tie-up.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
This is more imponderable, I think, but I'm thinking about the frequency or lack of frequency with which accessible information is actually accessed. The numbers that you were throwing out, a quarter to a third gets access to. And the things that cross my mind is we don't know in things like Google Scholar how much real consideration is given by a potential accessor of the information to what is presented in the bibliographic information on Google Scholar, for instance, or other finding mechanisms that somebody, in a sense, may be accessing it to really take the time to say, not quite what I'm looking for, but that's good to know about, even though they didn't click and open it, so there's no measurable activity that takes place. And I'm also wondering if anybody's ever done some studies on whether accesses are affected by the titles that researchers give to their work. That if you took the same article and gave 3 different titles to it, would one, I mean, just kind of market research, would one of them or more get a different level of access that others don't, to lead to perhaps advice that publishers or librarians or others interacting with researchers could give to help them raise those points, though doing that could lead to all sorts of chaos if you had the same article that was actually, cited differently. But I think it'd be interesting to dabble with that, because why is this any different than if you're starting to look at articles as a product, if you will, and you want consumers to engage with your product, then product marketing research dabbles in things like that. And has that ever been tried for scholarly content?
Should we take that in 2 parts? So one around what do we know about what researchers are actively doing once they've got to an article? Do we know what they've read or not, and what they do? And then secondly, come back to Bob's question more around, are there ways that we could look at different headlines or different abstracts that would drive people to the same piece of content?
I can cover the second part of it, because it was also in my workshop last week that there have been some studies. The ones that I highlighted in my workshop, there was one that looked at 3 different types of article titles. One with a question, one that was descriptive of the study, and one that was declarative or more suggesting of the results of the study. And of course, I don't have the slide in front of me and I can't remember, but there were differences. And they looked at downloads and citations. And I think it was the question that had more downloads but fewer citations. But there are absolutely, and I just mentioned it with search engine optimization, but there are also some articles looking at how your word choice in the title and the abstract affect your citation count and it affect who's looking at it. And that's absolutely something we talked about. And I think the way that you framed it is very accurate, that convincing researchers to think of themselves as needing to market their material, not in a gross way, was a lot of what we talked about, that your job as a researcher no longer ends when you publish the article, that's the end of one stage, and now you have to make sure it gets into the right hands.
And this is even extending to the abstract now. I mean, with
Yep.
abstract views being that, if the title is the first benchmark you have to jump, the next hoop you have to jump to get someone to download is the abstract. And so abstract views are through the roof, but the clicks may not happen because the abstract alone wasn't what they needed. So really researchers have to be thinking about both when trying to get to the click that gets to the citation.
I think PLOS published some research very similar on things like the length of the title correlated with citations, and short-titled work is cited more.
They said colons are bad.
Colons
Death
are
to the
bad,
colon.
abbreviations are good, but there's a whole series of things. Obviously, it's you can't run an A/B test and do it in parallel and see which will get the most clicks. But if you explain it in plain language and make it accessible, you're going to find that more search engines are picking up those terms, and that's going to lead to more click-throughs, I think. So yeah, that kind of makes sense intuitively, I think.
So the first part
So
was,
people are searching if they don't click through.
yeah, so how much do we know about what researchers are doing when they find the content on Google Scholar, for example?
Not much. I think. I mean,
Yeah.
there's also the preview. You hover over it and you see a little snippet of it. And people think that's for me or that's not for me. So I don't think there's been much research into
No,
that. Sort of preview.
I think there's other industries who are doing this extremely well. So Netflix is an example of where they can really see how far a program or how far a series viewers are getting. I don't think we've got that far within this industry yet, but there's obviously more that we'd like to know along those lines for sure.
Well, but certainly the library community has real sensitivity to knowing that much about user behavior, right? There's a certain degree of if a user wants to be anonymous and live on the IP without being logged in some way, they should be able to interact with content without necessarily being, deeply assessed. But that's the future. We're all going to be put in our algorithmic box, and you'll get your articles based on what you've been clicking on in the past.
Maintaining data privacy at
All time.
And GDPR compliance.
Well,
GDPR compliance all the time.
And I think there are some closed systems, like LinkedIn is the first one I think of, because I always get those emails about you appeared in so many searches this week. I know ResearchGate is doing more to kind of track search level. So I think within closed systems we might see some movement, but it is hard, and I think that because libraries protect researchers, that I don't think we're going to get to a place where we know every action. I don't think we want to.
This has actually come up in the context of open. So, for example, we recently hit a milestone in terms of downloads. So, chapter downloads for our open access books, which was over 30,000 downloads. And some of the questions we immediately got back was, well, what does that mean in the context of, so somebody's downloaded a chapter, what are they doing with that? And that's not something that we've the ability to track. But if content is openly published, it's more likely that people will download it. What they then go on to do is not something that there's been an awful lot of research around.
And that's why I think the citation analysis is important. So I was talking to a librarian today about, so much of the collection development analysis is done around usage, right? Looking at holdings versus usage. And we did an analysis on collection development for her institution using dimensions. And what we found is usage is one way to go. Where people are submitting their content, right, is one way to go. But the other piece that seems to be missing a lot is what content are people citing, right? Because once the download happens, you don't really know what happens. But if you can see where they're citing, you can start to do some triangulation around these are the journals they read, these are the journals they're downloading from, and then these are the journals they cite. And where do those match, and are they completely mismatched? And that can kind of close that loop a little bit.
And to give another digital science example, I think triangulating that along with the attention is where you can really see immediately that there's geographies that are being touched which otherwise might not have been, where there's immediate interest, where that lines up with media attention. So all of those things helps to surface that interest a bit more strongly. We've got time for a couple more questions.
So I'm Karen Guzman, I'm at Northwestern University, and I just want to say kudos for putting together the new research, or the tool for research manager. We work a lot with our centers and institutes to try to figure out or help them figure out a dissemination plan. We just came up with a template for them to start working off of about how they can select articles and what they can say. But I think one of the biggest hurdles is that late summary. And even if I say, like, here, I'm speaking and I wanted to tweet about the event that I'm speaking at, and I was like, oh, thank God, they pre-wrote the tweet for me.
Yeah.
You know, I'm excited to speak at the Charleston Cup. So, I mean, I think that's another key piece to this is like helping them with the language. So we talk about titles and abstracts, but it's also with the tweets and the Facebook posts and things. So can you talk at all about kind of the tools or resources you can show people to kind of help with that communication, that language, that plain language?
Yeah, so we at Kudos, what we do is we show a lot of examples of the sort of things that we know are effective. We do a lot of analysis of the plain language summaries and then correlate that with all metrics, citation, click-throughs and so on. So we've got a sense of what makes a good plain language summary. We're just in the process of now building in readability scores and then making recommendations about, you know, it's too long or it's too technical or try this sort of language. And we've got a whole series of ideas around that. So let's have a chat at the end. Happy to share more with you. But yeah, it's about guiding researchers so that they're using their precious time as effectively as they can because they want to be doing the research. They don't want to be doing all this administration and dissemination stuff. They want to be doing the research. So how do you help them be effective at that?
I'm going to turn it back to the panel for some closing thoughts then. So if you had one piece of advice for librarians to go back from this session to engage their researchers on the topic of impacts and open access, Rachel?
I think the future is article level impact. I think moving away from journal level is a smart move, and I think that speaks really well to open access, and I think that's where we do find that overlap.
I would say think about your audience. So think about who you want to reach and what is the most effective way of reaching that particular audience.
I think like have a come to Jesus or come to Buddha or whatever, chat with yourself about what impact means for you. In your field, you know, analytical chemistry doesn't get a lot of altmetric attention. It's not that it's not important research or good research, it's just not super exciting for, you know, the average layperson. So maybe altmetric attention is not the appropriate metric for you. If you're writing, you know, monographs in, you know, 17th century philosophy, citations may not be the most appropriate metric for you. And whether it's altmetric or some other tool you're using to evaluate reach, it needs to be appropriate to your field and to the research objects you produce. Figshare might be the most important place you live because you're producing data sets, code, and the engagement you see on Figshare is the way to go. So I think that's something that a lot of researchers are hamstrung by right now because the old guard is still using these very out-of-date ways of assessing to evaluate. I will definitely reiterate article level. Article level is absolutely the future. And as publishers start to contend with Plan S, which is like no joke, they are increasingly having to evaluate if thinking about journal versus article is valuable. So I would absolutely put my money on that.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then I will bring us to a close. Thank you very much for joining us.